fantastic speaker to go. And no coffee break. And we don't need a coffee break because our next speaker has been an associate of ULT for more than 40 years. She gives talks, she works with study groups, she's been a coordinator of the Vidya magazine, and she organized the ITC Forerunner in 2005 in Santa Barbara, and she is going to be our host in 2016. Her name is Carolyn Dorrance.
Well, good morning. I think it's still morning. And if you don't mind, I'll give us a little commercial break. Namely, so I'll step aside. We do hope you will take advantage of the free offering of Vidya magazine back there. There's stacks, there's order forms, and there's one back issue that the press manager chose that has many good articles on Manas. So you might want to pick one up, and therefore there's also, of course, the Secret Doctrine series and catalog information. You'd also be doing a social good because the suitcase being pulled by a senior citizen will be 15 hours later. So do take a Vidya and all of that. Okay, commercial over. So we do have these 3 questions orienting us and motivating us, hopefully, to look to the future and to imagine what Theosophy could be like 2,000 years from now. And predicting the future, of course, is hypothetical at best, and sometimes our predictions are just our fantasies of what we would like. We get the little slip in the Chinese cookie saying wisdom and prosperity is coming to you soon, and we like that prediction of the future, but does it ever come true? So we wonder what the future could bring to us. But Theosophy does offer an advantage because Theosophy does believe in the working of karma universally through vast cycles. And so everything is law-governed, effects are contained in causes. So that does suggest that the future may be understood by studying the present and the past, and that is indeed what historians are doing with big history. It's not so speculative to think in terms of 2,000-year cycles. Most of the ideas of current religion and philosophies, going back to, say, Plato, are flourished at the time of what's called the axial age 2,500 years ago. And so we have been working with those ideas for several centuries, and whether they should continue to be the foundation of our thought or whether they need some expansion, that I think is something every teacher of history and religion and philosophy has to face, but I think Theosophists should to look at the past 2,000 years, which has gone by fairly quickly, and see whether the messages are useful and humane. But we as Theosophists are focused on the impulsion of 1875 and on, and want to know if it's going to have a 2,000-year flourishment so that it will be carried on to for great purposes. So we embrace this opportunity to try to answer these questions, and my task is to answer them from the perspective of ULT, United Lodge of Theosophists, and its mission and its methods, but recognizing that we share so much. So for example, where's Aaron? Yeah. Next, go ahead. For example, if we try to answer the first question, how to keep her message alive for future generations, what do we think we could recollect from HBB's message, imagining that we could reincarnate in 2,000 years from now? Now, I went ahead and made a list. This is just came out of somebody's head of what ideas would you want to find if you did reincarnate 2,000 years from now, and see them as seminal ideas that really are the core of Theosophy. So this is not some official list, but as a student of Theosophy for several decades, and learning of these ideas in ULT study groups, I think they do have the flavor of ULT perspective. So first idea would be the ancient source, that there is continuity, and indeed that's what historians are finding out. There is continuity, and what we have today will be an ancient source 2,000 years from now. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. And that is the liquid wisdom and enlightenment that has been talked about so clearly in this conference, and that we could say that has to be alive and fresh and flowing. A second idea is duality. That duality, we're taught in the secret doctrine, is necessary for manifestation. You have to have a interaction of spirit and matter, of light and dark, and in just the process of learning needs the existence of duality. And why is this so important? Because how much trouble is caused by people pushing some one idea or one point of view, or thinking of whether it's one God, one law, and it really can lighten up the dialogue and the psychology if you recognize this inevitable duality in all existence. So there's always got to be two to tango. There's always got to be contrast, even conflict, in order for us to learn and periodically bring about more harmony so that another duality can emerge. We've heard lots this week about the three fundamentals, the axioms for pursuit of truth. We won't go into them because we have had so many presentations, but that certainly would have to be a recollected idea in the future, so that we have the framework of fundamental great ground of being, we might say, the countless operation of law through many cycles of manifestation, right down into very particular events right now. And we'd want to hear about the spiritual pilgrimage that all monads are on, and that in time gives opportunity for greater knowledge, greater wisdom, and fulfillment of spiritual evolution. And because that's the idea that we can grab onto and begin a very long journey. We've actually been on that journey for a very long time, but to give it a fresh energy and understanding. The four golden links that are presented by H.B. Blavatsky in the Key to Theosophy are very wonderful and valuable seeds for thought. We hear today so much about interdependence. We've talked about the possibilities of unity. So universal unity and causation, we think, is a very current mantra and an improvement on previous centuries. And we would hope that 2,000 years from now, the idea of a basic unity and the idea of a chain of causation that that nothing's outside that chain of causation. We recognize we have to work with this reality, that would be kind of basic to the psychology of the future. We hear about, fairly recently, we've had more attention to the idea of human solidarity, that rooted in the idea that we all share the spiritual core of our being, and that with that solidarity, and not only means something, but it has power. And it is what is going to draw us together. And if we want peace and nonviolence in the future, and we can hope that 2,000 years from now we've improved that on that great deal, that we have mastered both the idea and practice of human solidarity. Karma and reincarnation. Karma is coming into more general understanding. And so we would hope that by the 2,000 years that we would have a much more exact and multi-layered understanding of karma. It's not just about if you hit me, I'm going to hit you, but it is much more sophisticated, and that we can really become masters of karma and not victims in our own way of karma. The tough idea, as we all know, in trying to spread the teaching of Theosophy, is reincarnation, and that's what people tend to resist. So that's something we need to find ways to communicate more effectively, because that does have a great impact on understanding yourself, your relationships, your possibilities, and your do's and don'ts list. Another core idea, of course, that Theosophy in its current cycles has emphasized is the existence of a mind that is capable of abstraction, it's capable of endorsing moral principles, and so the mind, with its capacity for thinking, choosing, engaging in self-examination, presumably that could be just something that a child, perhaps is in ways we don't understand, attempting to do, but it would be just a capacity that is well developed. When we look at some of these horrible shootings, we just have the sense that the perpetrator shoots 9 people without a realization of the consequences, which are going to come swift and have a huge impact both on the shooter and the victims. So it's almost as if that capacity to examine our choices and choose wisely has to become a everyday, every moment kind of commitment. And we've talked a lot about compassion. The Dalai Lama is currently emphasizing that value, that tool for serving humanity and all that lives. And one can only hope that that would be far more part of our character and our psychology and our behavior than it is now. I put down number 7 as the mystery idea because I wanted to emphasize that this list is a list for thought and encourage people to add to it. An obvious 7th would be the higher self, but that's mysterious to understand. So we just wanted to keep a little open-ended there, and add to the list of ideas that you think need to be vibrant and well a part of the culture cultures 2,000 years from now. The second question, and we do think the analysis of the previous speaker on how we could try to understand ideas 2,000 years from now. It was very, very helpful, so we would encourage you to study that. Question 2, how to become a teacher in the footsteps of H.B. Blavatsky. We're going to answer this particularly from the point of view of ULT, which was founded by Robert Grosbie. We've heard at least 2 reviews of him and his founding of the United Lodge of Theosophists in 1909. He's not well known. He's seen as the quiet man, the steadfast man, the earnest man. When he first met Mr. Judge in Boston, Judge's comment right away is, "Grosbie, you're on my list." He never met HBB, but he was certainly focused and committed to her teaching and to her work, and let Judge be his guide and teacher. So there is a certain link there. And in 1908, he chose to move to Los Angeles and try to figure out what he could do for the spread of Theosophists in this big urban city that was booming with immigrants from the Midwest. And so what can I do? He had no resources to speak of, and he thought of, with great faith, of something very simple to do, is knock on the doors of neighbors and see if they would be interested in a study group. And so drawing them together for a year, they met and discussed the teaching. And we'll say more in a minute about why he thought that was an important method. And then in 1909, organized the ULT, the United Lodge of Theosophists, with the declaration that we've heard recited, I think, by Jim Colbert, that really included the sentence, "It regards as Theosophists all those who are engaged in the true service of mankind, without distinction of race, creed, sex, condition, or organization." Grosbie wanted to really de-emphasize organization, not have any elected leaders, not get into battles about sectarian differences and interpretations of certain parts of the secret doctrine, or whatever. So he had his perspective, which we'll talk about a little bit more. His writings are available, The Friendly Philosopher and The Universal Theosophy. This is a wonderful little book. It's easy to read because it's so much in a language of common sense, which we'll come back to in a minute. And you can find, if you're curious, you can find the texts on the ULT Phoenix website, and they were published and they're available for sale from the LA Lodge. So they are there for you to peruse if you wish to. Well, so he had to find. Oh, we're going to have a photo of Robert Grosbie. So. He was born as a Canadian. After business went bad, he went and lived in Boston and joined the Boston TS there. And that's where he met Judge, and that's where he did his work. Until after Judge's death, he went with Catherine Tingley and others to the Point Loma experiment. And after 4 years, he had a different methodology that he was interested in. So that's when he went to Los Angeles. But a very earnest man of great integrity, most people agree. And he kind of demonstrated the way that many of us can appreciate. First thing he had to do was to get a job to support himself. So he went to work for the Los Angeles Times for several years. What was his method and what was his message? Could we have the next slide, please? What was his method? And now we're looking really at the second question. How can we pursue these ideas. And reviewing Grosbie in the last several weeks, something struck me that I hadn't seen before. And this is the way it works, and this is the way we expect will work. He decided that in order to speak to and persuade people to listen to theosophical ideas and think about them, he had to present them in a common language, in a common person's language. And I'll just read you a paragraph that was one of his, kind of shows where he was at and how he could get people to listen, because what he was talking about, it actually had some very difficult depth to it, but there was so much language that people could understand, even if they didn't understand. We must give up the idea that we are poor, weak, miserable creatures who can never do anything for ourselves. For as long as we hold to that idea, so long we never do anything. We must get the other idea, that we are spirit, that we are immortal. And when we come to realize what that means, the power of it will flow directly in and through us. Another paragraph, Theosophy presents a larger view in showing that man is not his body, because the body is continually changing. That man is not his mind, because he's constantly changing his mind. That there is in man a permanency, which is the identity throughout all kinds of embodiments. There's been no change in our identity from childhood to the present day. The body has changed, the surroundings have changed, but the identity remains the same and will not change from now on through all changes of mind or body or circumstance. Now, if you were hearing this for the first time, wouldn't you have some sense of, oh yeah, the identity? Yes, things are always changing. Yes, I've been stuck on this idea that I've done sinful things. And of course, that was the message from some sources very intensely. You could connect with the language. And there's not a lot of Sanskrit. There's not a lot of abstract ideas. It's an invitation to a conversation that you feel you could kind of get into. He was helped by the new developments of the French philosophers in the 19th century, talk about consciousness, creative evolution. Now, we take these words for granted, but they weren't familiar words to everybody. But they were words he picked up, and an interesting connection that I would like to explore. If you read the books of the 1960s, 70s, of the various gurus who are coming over and talking about yoga and consciousness raising and the spiritual path and things like that. If you read the language of those mid to late 20th century gurus, most of them coming out of the Hindu and Buddhist tradition, you find that they seem to have the same framework and vocabulary as Robert Grosbie has done. It doesn't mean he is criticizing the language of the secret doctrine or the key to Theosophy is being too elusive. It just means that he thought it important to talk to people and create this conversation in small study groups with a language that was becoming more familiar to people. And then once he had them, you might say, listening, then he had a certain methodology that is explained in various ways. And one thing he does is he doesn't have like some formal organization. He may be talking about the same idea on page 5 as he does on page 225. So he understands that repetition is important. But his other kind of, you might say, teaching technique is that you gather people, and maybe it's just an individual, and you ask questions and try to evoke from them what it is they've observed and experienced. Because Crosbie said the starting point for a human being thinking is to take note of observation and experience, and if they work at it, they can reason from those observations and that experience. So that's a very ground level starting point. And if you could invite them to share their experience. Let's say if you wanted to teach them about karma, you ask questions, well, you know, have you ever seen a connection between something you said or did and something that happened? And you try to get the student to, or the listener to come up with some memory of where they did see cause and effect at work. And then kind of expand the questioning. Well, how do you think that happens? Well, at some point you get to a plateau of thought, and that may be ripe for introducing the terminology of karma. So you don't start with the new terminology. You start with the individual trying to draw out from themselves what it is they're trying to, that they've experienced. And that's important because it kind of fits with, particularly in American society as far as we can see, the desire to talk about yourself and to explain your experience to somebody. And this brings the student alive. They're not being put into a situation that's strange to them and that they're going to have to listen to somebody explain some intellectual proposition. They become more awake and more engaged in the conversation. And then they become ready for some more explanation about karma and its broader scope and things like that. And as this evoking of understanding and goes on, two things are going to happen, Crosbie thinks. One is the thinking mind is going to be awoken, and that thinking mind will obviously become an important tool in calming the kama manas and calming the lower nature, and it enables fellowship to come in and be a kind of an envelope around the education. Because that's important too, that the person has an experience that is both builds confidence in that their capacity to think about things that they've never thought about, but builds confidence and sensitive feeling that they're they're connected to people, namely the other people in the study group, and if they stick around more, brotherhood becomes more and more active. So that was Crosbie's method, you might say, very much in the teaching mode. And if you go to the annual study group in the LA Lodge in late August, you find that, that method being demonstrated very well. He also, locality is on here. ULT, as we heard, is a very open-ended kind of association. It's not there's no formal organization. Lots of local lodges and local study groups. And there's a great deal of commitment to self-determination, and it works pretty well. Maybe there's things that it can't do as well as more organized groups, but it does allow for inexpensive meetings and very low cost, and transportation, things like that. So you have locality, which is very much in the tradition of American groups and all of that, another topic. So the neighborhood approach is part of Grosbie's methodology. And so if a group gets strong somewhere and wants to organize, there's no one going to stop them from organizing a lodge. There's also the idea of leadership being natural. And there's no one way to describe how leadership emerges in the ULT orbit. It is ascriptive. A group of people, obviously people recognize Grosbie as the leader for that time being, and worked with him. And that seemed to keep an idea of impersonality. I remembered the phrase ripeness is all as a way of the way the leadership works, that it's at certain times this is the leader. But there's always an emphasis on everybody being part of the doing of things. So there's no formal principle of authority. And that's the ULT approach to organization and activity, and that would be how you follow the teachings of HBB by being a close student of the teaching, working together, and finding ways, open to all kinds of creative ways. The Los Angeles Lodge has surprised us all by its remarkable success in setting up Spanish language study groups. And the edition of the original version of The Secret Doctrine is going to be out next year in Spanish. And so that's a very appropriate way to follow in HBB's footsteps at this time. And so someplace there might be other methods. I remember when the Phoenix Lodge was pioneering and having broadcast study groups on the internet. Now that's done quite commonly, but it was an innovation. So the very important part is to try to experiment and to see what works. And I think all the groups, as far as I can see, in the Theosophical movement are doing that, experimenting. There we go, the Japanese method of teaching. I don't know if this is an official school, but I remember watching a documentary some years ago of Japanese teaching moral education in an elementary school. I think it was fourth graders. And their method was you first show a video of a problem, then the teacher gives a little talk with explanation, and then you have a Q&A. And the point is you have to go over the lesson in some way at least 3 times for it to stick. And I think that's what the small group, study group allows, is that something like that Japanese method. Out of this will come more intellectual understanding, and with connection to what is practical. And another part of the openness of ULT that seems to be effective is to not take positions, and generally this is the advice of Theosophy, on political issues, social issues. It may be appropriate to have discussions about it, but the main purpose is to keep the teachings alive by a flexible pursuit of understanding, and with that presumably you will go forth effectively over another 2,000 years. It's also a method that allows enjoyment, just this enjoyment of being part of a group that is active. And so we think that these are some of the ways in which we can keep the core ideas of the message alive. And of course, publications and videos, and as many have already suggested, that is that's part of the method too, okay? So those are just some answers to these 3 questions. We're always at the beginning of a cycle because we're always trying to do something now, and Grosbie was very much a messenger of duty now. He very frank about, your problem is false ideas. This isn't a book about sainthood. This isn't a book about abstract or mystical teaching. There's no opposition to cultivating more mystical searches. And there's certainly no opposition to full-on study of the secret doctrine. But the focus to begin with is on what are you doing to become an agent, a creative agent of disseminating Theosophy. And that's where you need to, and that's always where you can find strength. If you keep focused on that very direct purpose of intellectual and ethical understanding and teaching of the basic theosophical ideas. So that being said, we'd like the next slide, please, or next couple of slides. Guess where that is? We can continue this discourse next year. The method, that's the mountains, Santa Barbara, nestled in the mountains. Next one. That's one view of Casa de la Maria, where the conference will be held. So you can, that actually goes into the chapel we're not using. And the next one is one more. Yeah. That gives you a little bit more about the Spanish and architecture, and those are the mountains right behind the retreat center. So if you're a hiker or a biker, there's lots of room for that. Okay, so thank you very much, and see you next year.
So thank you, Carolyn, for sharing your perspective, the ULT perspective, and especially the teachings and method of Robert Grosbie. I don't know how about you, but I'm already looking forward to going to Santa Barbara next year, right? So time to cross-pollinate, right? Because we've heard so many great ideas. So how can we mix and mingle and cross-pollinate everything together and move forward together, especially? And guys, please be back here 1 or 2 minutes before 12 so we can cross-pollinate together. Have a good workshop. And there will be coffee again in the rooms. Oh, your name.